Imagine a silence so total it has weight. A silence that presses down from a slate-gray sky and blankets the world in white. This was the silence of the high Rockies in the dead of winter, 1872. It was a quiet that could drive a man mad, or it could become his only friend. For Finian, it was the latter. He was a man built on the same scale as the mountains he called home. A giant with shoulders as broad as a doorway and a chest thick enough to stop a charging bull. A wild, tangled mane of dark hair fell to his shoulders, and a beard of the same color covered the lower half of his weathered face, making his ice-blue eyes seem even more piercing. His life was a simple, hard rhythm of checking trap lines, chopping wood, and watching the seasons turn. He had long ago decided that the company of pines and peaks was preferable to the deceit and noise of men. The world below could have its gold rushes and its railroad feuds. He wanted none of it. But on this day, the silence was broken. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the groan of a snow-laden branch. It was something else. A scent on the wind, sharp and metallic, cutting through the clean smell of frost and pine. Blood. And with it, the fainter, more troubling smell of smoke. Finian paused, his massive frame perfectly still, his head cocked. His old hound, Gus, let out a low growl from beside his sealskin-wrapped boots. Then he saw them. Tracks. Not the familiar print of elk or bear, nor the moccasined tread of the Ute hunting parties that sometimes passed through the lower valleys. These were the prints of shod horses and heavy, flat-soled boots, clumsy and brutal in the deep powder. They were heading toward the pass, the one place a wagon might foolishly try to cross this late in the season. A cold knot formed in Finian's gut. He had not sought out the world of men, but it seemed today that world had come bleeding into his. He shifted the weight of the Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm and began to follow. What he did not yet know was that this trail of blood would lead him not to an ending, but a beginning that would shatter the quiet peace of his life forever. The scene was worse than he had imagined. Tucked into a narrow defile, meant to offer shelter from the wind, were the remains of a single, large wagon. It was still smoldering, its heavy canvas cover burned away to reveal a blackened skeleton of wood and iron. The snow around it was a nightmare canvas of red and white, churned by struggle and stained with death. 4 men lay half buried in the drifts, their bodies contorted in the final, violent moments of their lives. They were guards by the look of their holsters, but they'd been no match for their attackers. The work was professional, brutal, but efficient. Arrows were not the cause. This was the work of gunfire, close and overwhelming. Finian moved through the wreckage with a grim economy of motion, his eyes scanning for any sign of life, though he expected none. The attackers had taken the horses and anything of value. It was a robbery, but it felt like more. It felt like an execution. He was about to turn back, to leave this cold grave to the winter, when a flicker of color caught his eye. It was a splash of impossible softness against the harsh landscape. Pale pink. Half hidden beneath a splintered wagon wheel lay a figure, so small and still he at first mistook her for a fallen doll. He knelt, his large frame casting a long shadow over her. She was a woman, Chinese by her features, with skin like porcelain and hair as black as a raven's wing splayed against the snow. She was dressed in a garment he had never seen before, a silk dress of delicate pink, now torn and stained with soot and blood. It was a dress made for warm evenings in a manicured garden, not for the unforgiving cold of a mountain pass. He reached out a hesitant, calloused finger, expecting to find her skin as cold as the ice beneath. But when he touched her neck, he felt it. A pulse. Faint, thready, but there. A flicker of life in the midst of all this death. A deep, guttural sigh escaped him. He couldn't leave her. To do so would be to finish the work these butchers had started. With a grunt, he gently lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. As he cradled her against his broad chest, her head lolled against his shoulder, and he began the long, slow trek back to his cabin. The strange, soft silk of her dress a bizarre contrast to the rough wool of his coat. The mountain silence was gone, replaced by the sound of his own heavy breathing and the faint, fluttering heartbeat of the stranger in his arms. Back in the warmth of his small, sturdy cabin, the fire crackling in the stone hearth, Finian laid her gently on his own cot, a rough bed of pine boughs and bear pelts. He worked with a surprising delicacy for a man of his size, his massive hands carefully cutting away the ruined sleeve of her pink dress to expose a deep, wicked gash along her forearm. It was sluggishly bleeding, and the skin around it was already hot to the touch. Fever was setting in. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, earning a low moan from the depths of her unconsciousness, then bound it tightly with clean strips of linen. He brewed a strong, bitter tea from willow bark, a trick he'd learned from a Ute elder years ago to fight fever, and gently spooned the warm liquid past her lips. For 2 days she drifted in and out of a fevered delirium, murmuring in a language that was nothing but soft, liquid sounds to his ears. He sat by her side, keeping the fire stoked, bathing her brow with cool water, and forcing more of the willow bark tea into her. In those long hours he studied her face, the fine arch of her eyebrows, the elegant curve of her cheekbones. She was from a world so far removed from his own, it might as well have been the moon. He wondered what story had brought her to this violent end in the middle of nowhere. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and deep and full of terror. They widened as they took in the sight of him, this bearded giant looming over her in the firelight. She scrambled backward on the cot, a frightened gasp escaping her lips, her uninjured hand coming up as if to ward him off. She spoke, a rush of panicked words he could not understand. He held up his hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. "Easy," he rumbled, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. "You're safe." The words meant nothing to her, but the tone seemed to soothe her slightly. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the stacked firewood, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, the rifle propped against the wall. He saw the moment she decided he was not one of her attackers. The terror in her eyes receded, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. As she shifted, the sleeve of her dress slipped down, revealing something on the delicate skin of her inner wrist. It was a brand, a small, intricate mark in the shape of a coiled dragon. He had seen brands on cattle and horses, but never on a person. To him it looked like a mark of ownership, and a fresh wave of pity and anger washed over him. Whoever she was someone's property, and someone had wanted their property destroyed. The stakes of his decision to save her suddenly became terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just sheltering a lost woman. He was hiding a fugitive. The blizzard arrived that night, a howling white fury that descended from the peaks and swallowed the world whole. For a week, they were prisoners in the small log cabin, the wind shrieking like a banshee outside the thick walls. The world shrank to the size of that single room, lit by the flickering fire and smelling of wood smoke, drying wool, and the strange, faint scent of jasmine that seemed to cling to her despite her ordeal. Communication was a slow, clumsy dance of gestures and pantomime. He would point to the water bucket, and she would nod. She would point to the dwindling stack of firewood, and he would bundle himself in furs to brave the storm for more. He learned that she was resilient. There was a core of steel beneath that porcelain exterior. She would insist on helping, her small hands folding his blankets with a precision that seemed innate, or attempting to sweep the hearth with a pine bough broom. He learned her name was Leanne. She pointed to her chest and said it, the sound like a small bell. Leanne. He pointed to his own chest. Finian. She repeated it, her pronunciation soft and melodic. The walls he had built around himself, stone by stone over years of solitude, began to show the faintest of cracks. He found himself watching her, the way she moved with an unconscious grace, even in his rough-spun clothes. The way she would stare into the fire, her expression a mixture of grief and steely resolve. One night he awoke to a small sound. He turned his head from his spot on the floor by the hearth and saw her sitting on the edge of the cot, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was trying to stifle the sound, but a raw, desolate grief poured out of her. Finian's heart, a muscle he thought had long since hardened, clenched in his chest. He was a man of action, not words. He had no comfort to offer, no language to soothe her. So he did the only thing he could think of. He rose, ladled some warm broth from the pot simmering over the fire into a wooden mug, and walked over to her. He didn't speak. He simply knelt and placed the mug in her trembling hands. Her tear-filled eyes met his. In that moment, something shifted between them. She saw not a fearsome giant, but a protector. He saw not a fragile victim, but a survivor. A fragile trust was born in the heart of the storm. But as the blizzard raged, Finian knew a deeper truth. The men who had attacked her wagon were not the type to be deterred by weather. They were hunters, and when the snows cleared, they would come back to finish their hunt. As the blizzard finally blew itself out, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted white, a tentative routine formed within the cabin. Leanne's strength returned daily. The color came back to her cheeks, and the haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She began to pick up more of his language, her mind quick and observant. "Cup," she would say, holding one up. "Spoon. Blanket." Each new word was a small victory, a bridge built across the chasm of their different worlds. She carried a small, tightly wrapped bundle of silk that she had salvaged from the wreckage, a package she guarded with a fierce jealousy. It was the only thing she had left of her former life, and she never let it out of her sight. One afternoon, Finian was outside, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood echoing in the crisp air. He was lost in the work, the familiar burn in his shoulders a welcome distraction from the complicated emotions the woman in his cabin stirred in him. Inside, Leanne took a rare moment of solitude to unwrap her treasure. Her fingers, still graceful despite the encroaching calluses, carefully unfolded the layers of pink silk. Within lay a single object, a seal carved from the purest, greenest jade. It was cool and heavy in her palm, carved with an elaborate dragon coiling around ancient characters. It was the imperial seal, the symbol of her father's authority, entrusted to her for a journey that was supposed to take her to a new life, a political marriage to secure an alliance across the sea. She traced the carving with her fingertip, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. Just as she was about to wrap it again, the cabin door swung open, and Finian entered, his arms laden with split logs. He stopped short, his eyes immediately drawn to the object in her hands. He had never seen such a thing, but the quality of the jade, the masterful carving, and the reverent way she held it spoke of immense value and power. She flinched, trying to hide it, but it was too late. He had seen it. He dropped the wood into the box by the hearth with a loud clatter and took a step toward her. He didn't look angry, but his gaze was intense. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low. She looked from the seal to his face, her heart pounding. The time for secrets was over. She took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eye. Using the few English words she knew, she pieced together the devastating truth. "My father," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He is king." She stumbled over the unfamiliar word, but its meaning was unmistakable. "Emperor." The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Finian stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. The professional assassins, the desperation to leave no survivors, the brand on her arm. It wasn't a mark of ownership. It was a brand for a runaway of unimaginable importance. He was not just hiding a fugitive. He was sheltering a princess. The men hunting her were not mere bandits. They were agents of an empire, and they would stop at nothing to find her. The revelation of Leanne's identity settled a new kind of quiet in the cabin. It was no longer the comfortable silence of shared solitude, but a heavier, more charged atmosphere. Finian found himself looking at her differently. He saw the subtle authority in her posture, the innate dignity that no amount of hardship could erase. His protective instincts, already fierce, sharpened into a razor's edge. He was no longer just a man helping a woman. He was the unlikely guardian of a royal bloodline, the sole protector of a secret that could get them both killed. He became more vigilant, spending hours on the high ridges, scanning the vast, empty wilderness with his spyglass for any sign of movement. Leanne, in turn, seemed to shed the last of her fear of him. She understood that this giant, silent man was now her only ally in a world that wanted her dead. She began to take a more active role in their shared survival. She had a keen eye for plants, and as the first signs of a thaw began to appear, she would point out shoots and roots he had overlooked, things that could be made into teas or added to their stew. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle by the fire, he noticed her watching him. She was holding one of his old, worn-out flannel shirts, a garment riddled with small tears and frays. From her precious silk bundle she produced a small bone needle and a spool of dark thread. She sat on the cot, the oversized shirt draped across her lap, and began to mend it. Her fingers, so clearly unaccustomed to such labor, moved with a surprising deftness and concentration. The firelight danced on her bent head, illuminating the focused line of her jaw and the smooth blackness of her hair. Finian stopped his work, the oiled rag still in his hand, and simply watched her. The small domestic act was so profoundly out of place, and yet so perfectly right. Here was a princess, a woman raised in a palace surrounded by servants, meticulously stitching the shirt of a rough mountain man in a one-room cabin. It was in these quiet moments that the bond between them deepened, woven from threads of shared danger and unspoken admiration. The air grew thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the men who were hunting her. It was the awareness of his size and her delicacy, of his loneliness and her loss. The quiet before the storm was the longest, most beautiful silence of their lives. The false spring held for 3 days, a deceptive thaw that turned the snow to slush and sent trickles of meltwater down the mountainside. The world felt alive again, but with that life came a renewed sense of dread. Travel was easier now, for them and for their enemies. The first warning came from Gus. The old hound, usually asleep by the fire, stood at the door one morning. The fur on his neck bristled, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in his chest. His attention was fixed down the mountain, toward the winding game trail that was the only approach to the cabin. Finian trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. He grabbed his spyglass and his rifle and slipped out, moving with a hunter's silence through the trees to a high, rocky outcropping that gave him a clear view of the valley below. He swept the landscape, his eye catching every detail. At first he saw nothing but trees and snow. Then, a flicker of movement. He focused the spyglass. 3 riders. They were moving slowly, methodically, their heads turning from side to side as they scanned the terrain. They were dressed in the rough clothes of prospectors, but they sat their horses with the ramrod straight posture of soldiers. One of them, the leader, paused and looked up, his gaze sweeping the very ridge where Finian was hiding. Even from this distance, Finian could see the cold arrogance in the man's profile. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air snaked down Finian's spine. They had found his valley. It was only a matter of time before they found his cabin. He slid back from the ledge and made his way back, his heart a heavy, cold stone in his chest. When he entered the cabin, Leanne was standing by the table, kneading a small lump of dough for bannock bread. She looked up, and the simple, domestic hope in her eyes died when she saw his face. He didn't need to say a word. The quiet peace they had built was over. Her face paled, but her hands did not tremble. The fear was there, but it was now tempered with a hard resolve. She had survived a massacre. She would not be taken easily. They worked together in grim silence. He pulled the heavy wooden table in front of the door, reinforcing it. He dragged his heaviest chests against the cabin's single small window, leaving only a narrow slit to shoot through. He laid out his ammunition on the mantelpiece, counting the cartridges. He took the heavy skinning knife from his belt and held it out to her, handle first. "Stay away from the door," he growled. "Stay in the corner, by the hearth." She took the knife. Her grip was sure and steady. Her dark eyes met his, and in them he saw not a princess, but a warrior. They didn't have to wait long. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the snow-covered peaks, the riders emerged from the trees. They fanned out, creating a half circle around the front of the cabin, their rifles held at the ready. Gus was barking furiously now, a frantic, savage sound that echoed the frantic beating of Finian's own heart. The leader, a man with a thin, cruel mouth, dismounted and strode forward, stopping just outside of easy rifle range. "Mountain man," he called out, his voice sharp and laced with an accent Finian couldn't place. "We have no quarrel with you. We know she's in there, the property of the Tong. Send her out, and we will leave you with your life and your miserable hovel." Property. The word ignited a fire in Finian's gut. He looked over at Leanne, who was pressed into the corner as he'd instructed, her knuckles white where she gripped the knife. He saw the flash of fury and humiliation in her eyes. He raised his Winchester to the firing slit. His reply was not a word, but a deafening roar of gunfire that sent the leader diving for cover as a chunk of bark exploded from the tree beside his head. The fight had begun. The air filled with the crack of rifles. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Finian was methodical, a force of controlled violence. He fired, ducked, reloaded, and fired again, making every shot count. One of the riders cried out and slumped over his saddle, his horse bolting into the trees. Two left. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, decided on a direct assault. He charged the cabin door, slamming his full weight against it. The heavy wood groaned, the iron hinges screaming in protest. A crack appeared, then another. The man drew a large revolver and fired through the splintering wood, the shots deafeningly loud in the small space. Finian shoved Leanne deeper into the corner. "Stay down!" he roared. An arm holding the pistol punched through the ruined door, searching for a target. In that moment, Leanne moved. She was not a warrior, but she was a survivor. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, shoving its tip deep into the glowing red embers of the fire. With a cry that was part terror and part rage, she lunged forward as the man's arm groped through the opening. She slammed the white-hot tip of the poker against the back of his hand. A high-pitched, inhuman shriek of agony filled the air. The gun dropped. As the man recoiled, Finian fired his Winchester directly through the shattered door. The shrieking stopped. During the chaos, a bullet from the leader's rifle punched through the wall and tore a fiery path across Finian's left shoulder. Pain, hot and blinding, exploded through him. He stumbled back with a grunt, but forced himself to stay upright, his jaw clenched against the agony. One man left. The silence that fell was more menacing than the gunfire. The leader was smart. He was patient. He had seen Finian get hit. Now he would wait, using the growing darkness as his ally, letting the mountain man bleed out or make a fatal mistake. Finian pressed himself against the wall, breathing heavily, the warm stickiness of blood spreading across his back. He knew his time was limited. Leanne was at his side instantly, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the blood. "You are hurt," she whispered. "It's nothing," he lied, his voice strained. Outside, the leader began to move, circling the cabin to find a better angle, a weaker point. He was confident, arrogant. He saw the mountain as nothing more than terrain to be conquered, and that was his mistake. He never saw it coming. As he moved along the steep, snow-covered slope behind the cabin, his boots dislodged a thick cornice of snow that had been destabilized by the day's thaw and the percussive shock of the gunfight. It started with a soft hiss, a sound almost lost in the wind. Then a low rumble that grew with terrifying speed into a deafening roar. A wall of white fury, a localized avalanche of snow, ice, and rock broke free from the mountainside. It poured down the gully directly behind the cabin, a torrent of unstoppable power. The assassin had only a moment to look up, his face a mask of disbelief, before the mountain itself struck him down. The wave of snow swept him up, tossing him like a rag doll before burying him completely, his final shout swallowed by the roar. The sound faded, leaving behind an eerie, ringing silence. It was over. Inside the cabin, Finian sagged against the wall, the last of his strength leaving him. Leanne rushed to his side, her face streaked with soot and tears. Without hesitation, she took the hem of her ruined, precious pink dress and tore a long strip of silk from it. She pressed the makeshift bandage firmly against his bleeding shoulder, her touch surprisingly strong. He looked up at her, at the fierce, untamed fire in her eyes, a look he knew he would never forget. "You were brave," he breathed, the words costing him. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I am not property," she said, her English perfect, each word a declaration of war and a vow of survival. Spring came to the high country, not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering force. The sun grew stronger, turning the mountainsides into 1,000 weeping waterfalls. The snowpack retreated, revealing the first green shoots of new life. The blood that had stained the ground outside the cabin was washed away, and the harsh memories of that violent evening began to fade, replaced by the hard work of living. Finian's shoulder healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar that mirrored the older marks that crisscrossed his body. Leanne tended to him with a quiet, fierce devotion, her knowledge of herbs and remedies proving to be a skill as vital as his knowledge of hunting. They buried the bodies of the assassins deep in the woods, a grim task that solidified their shared secret. With the past now clear, she could have left. She could have tried to find her way to a city, to find passage back to her homeland, or to disappear into this new country. But she knew her old life was a ghost. To return would be to return to a death sentence. Her throne was lost, her family likely murdered, her kingdom was gone. So she stayed. She stayed, and the one-room cabin on the side of the mountain became her world. Finian's solitary existence was transformed. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence. He learned the cadence of her speech as her English improved, the sound of her humming as she worked, the scent of the strange, fragrant teas she brewed from mountain flowers. She learned the rhythms of his life, the way he moved through the woods with such impossible quiet, the deep well of gentleness hidden beneath his formidable exterior. He was no longer just a protector, and she was no longer just a survivor. They were partners, forged in violence and tempered by the quiet intimacy of their shared isolation. One evening, as the last light of the day painted the highest peaks in hues of rose and gold, the color of her tattered dress, they stood together outside the cabin. The air was cool and clean, filled with the promise of summer. He looked at her, at the woman who had fallen out of the sky and into his life, and realized his world was no longer gray and white. She had filled it with color. He reached out and took her hand, his large, calloused palm, the hand of a trapper and a fighter, completely enveloped her slender one. It was a perfect fit. No words were needed. In the heart of the wild, surrounded by the silent, watching mountains, they had built a new life, a kingdom of two. The story of Finian and Leanne is a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not the ones we seek, but the ones that find us in our darkest moments. It's a tale of how survival can blossom into something more, and how a home can be built in the most unlikely of places. If their story of courage and unexpected love resonated with you, please give this video a like to help us share it with others. Consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a story of frontier resilience. And for more tales from the untamed heart of the Old West, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of their story was the most powerful for you? Let us know in the comments below.